All right. So Reubens' predictions then are that the laws and policies will then reflect the propagating agents. So depending on who your propagating agents are, the laws and the institutions of your country will reflect their wishes, their desires. Um, where their economic elite is part of those propagating agents, they will be more successful in the long run because the economic elite will advocate for policies that are good, conducive to economic growth, as we saw in the case of England. They were advocating for restrictions on monopolies. They were advocating for access to credit. They were advocating for trade and property rights, which we all know as institutions that will lead to growth. Third point that Rubin makes is if your rulers are legitimized by religious authorities, those places will stagnate because ultimately they will advocate for policies that do not lead to economic growth. Okay, so where is the origin of these differences in propagation? What is the origin and who is the propagating agents? Well, Rubin kind of says, all right, this has to do with kind of institutions that you get at the start, or that are existing in that society, and then also, of course, these would be a product of your history and the history of your religion or other cultural or other aspects of culture in your society. So he's really going to drill into both Islam and Christianity to show how different these were in their origin and how that led to differences in ability to be a propagating agent. Essentially, it was much easier for um, uh, 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 an Islamic cleric to be a propagating agent than a Christian one. All right. So, what is going on at the beginning of these religions? So, with Islam, it develops as a religion and an empire at the same time. So it's a religious force, but also a political force. So it's intertwined from the very beginning. So it's a new religion, and then it's also a new political force. So it's the religion is developing alongside a set of laws and institutions, and those are intertwined. So therefore, it's embedded is its ability to legitimize the ruler. And we see it in the sacred text. So we see it in the Quran. We see Muhammad, it is obligatory for one to listen to and obey the ruler's orders, unless these orders involve one, disobedience to Allah. But if an act is of disobedience to Allah is imposed, he should not listen to obey it. So right there, it's like, hey, if you should follow the ruler as long as what he's doing is in concordance with Allah's wishes. So who gets to decide that? Well, the clergy, the religion. They get to decide, hey, this ruler is following the teachings of Allah, therefore they are legitimate. So that gives immense power to the clergy right there. They can essentially, built into the religion is their power to legitimize a ruler. All right, going to Christianity. So Christianity develops as essentially like a small religious sect kind of outside of the mainstream. So it's like this, it's like, at the beginning, Jesus and his followers are a bunch of just like crazy kooks, doing their thing. He's like he's a preacher, essentially like walking around, giving sermons, and then it develops into a more formal religion after his death, as his apostles go out. But it's inside this other political entity, the Roman Empire, which has its own set of legal and political institutions. So this religion is developing like over here, and it's separate from the existing political powers. In many cases, persecuted by those political powers. So it's not really focused on. It's focused on like the teachings. It's not really focused on ruling or legitimating any ruler. And again, we see it in the sacred text. So here are some passages from the New Testament. Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So there's a separation. Here's the person in charge on the earth. Here is the person in charge in eternity. They are separate. This next one, two, there are august emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, the sacred authority of the priesthood and the royal power. So it's saying there's two things. We have the ruler on earth, the august emperor, and then we have the sacred authority of the priesthood. Okay, and these things are separate. So kind of built in there is the separation of church and state. So it's going to be a little harder for Christianity to legitimate a ruler. All right. So over time, so initially what we have is, these two are growing alongside each other: the political power and the religion, the Muslim religion. Um, and there's lots of interpretation. So the religion is kind of open for interpretation. The clerics are kind of changing things, changing the interpretation of that or this. But eventually, as their power becomes entrenched, they're less responsive to the citizens. So, initially they are more open to kind of changing the interpretation of certain passages to allow for different institutions, to allow for different behavior. But once their powers are entrenched, they become less responsive. And this is referred to as the gate of the jihad. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, although I am technically a Muslim, had to convert for marriage, although obviously not practicing. Um, so, um, so essentially, they stop that responsiveness in the 10th century, even though it is very, open and free in terms of, allowing for different institutions, different behavior. Christianity is kind of interesting because, initially it starts out as this small sect, but then eventually it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So it eventually, is elevated to being the state religion, and in that period, it does have a lot of legitimating power. However, that really unravels throughout the 10th to 13th centuries, as we kind of get this fracturing of the empire, sorry. And there is kind of new elites that emerge that rulers can turn to raise money. So we have, a set of like local landed elites. We also have commercial elites. We start to have that merchant class that the ruler can draw upon for, fiscal support, and then also as legitimating agents. And then eventually we get the Reformation. So the Reformation is, is the Protestant Revolution. So the Reformation, Martin Luther, says essentially changes what Christianity was about. He makes it much more focused on the individual rather than the church. He says, now we're going to translate the Bible into your language, the language you speak. You have the power to read the Bible yourself and kind of have your own personal relationship with God, whereas before the church mediated that relationship. Only the priests could speak Latin, which is what the texts were written in, and it was their job to interpret it for you. Martin Luther comes along with the Reformation and changes that all. And so that greatly diminishes the power of the church in Western Europe going forward. Okay, and so what are the economic elites? What are the economic consequences? So if I'm running an Islamic state, it's much easier for me to be legitimized by the religious elite. Whereas in Western Europe, I have lots of other options. In fact, if I'm running an Islamic state, essentially I have to be legitimized by the religious elite. And so for Jared Rubin, he says, well, look, these Middle Eastern states, they start out ahead economically, but essentially they stagnate because the rulers are essentially responding to the clerics. They're essentially pursuing policies that are favorable to the clerics, and those policies are not necessarily conducive to growth. Whereas in Europe, the rulers are much more responsive to the economic elites rather than the religious elites. Okay, take a break there.